Good morning to all of you. Sir is present among us. Ananya, please start the program.
Thank you, Debabrata. Am I audible?
Yes, yes.
Okay. Good morning, respected speaker, my senior and junior colleagues of the academia, dear students and participants. I welcome you all on behalf of the Department of Philosophy, Kaji Nazrul University, Asansol, West Bengal, to the fourth day of the ICPS sponsored lecture series on Philosophy and Ethics. Today, we are excited to present you the topic Philosophy and Ethics.
অনন্যা, শোনা যাচ্ছে না? অনন্যা? অনন্যা?
I think due to network issue, she is not audible to us. I request the head to call Ananya.
Sir, please wait. Ananya is network issue.
No
वो ज्वाइन
problem
कर
at
रहा
all.
है अभी.
Yeah, I understand. No problem.
Good afternoon to good morning to all of you. Today is the fourth day of the ICPS sponsored special lecture series on values and well-being, classical and contemporary
Hello.
Indian philosophical perspectives. Today's speaker is Professor Balaganapati Devarakonda. Ananya, please.
Yeah. Hello, Devabrata. Am I audible now?
Yes. Okay, start.
Okay. Extremely sorry for the inconvenience. Okay. Should I continue? Okay. 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 We express our gratitude to the Indian Council of Philosophical Research Academic Exchange. We are also ever grateful to our Honorable Vice Chancellor, Professor Shadha Chakraborty, for encouraging us to undertake various programs and mentoring us throughout the processes. Today, we are extremely honored to have with us Professor Balaganapati, social and political philosophy and philosophical practice. In addition to teaching and research, Professor Devarakonda is a certified philosophical counselor by the American Philosophy Practitioners Association, New York. Professor Balaganapati Devarakonda has authored several major books and articles in different areas and has delivered lectures at numerous national and international platforms. He is and has been holding several important academic and administrative positions. We express our heartiest thanks to Sir for giving us his valuable time from his very busy schedule. All of us are eagerly waiting to listen to you, sir. Over to you, sir.
I hope I am audible, right? Can you
Yes,
hear
sir.
me?
Yes,
Thank you
sir.
so
Yes,
much
sir.
for that kind introduction. Thank you so much. Dear Dr. Debabrata Saha, Head of the Department of Philosophy at Qazi Nazrul University, and other colleagues at the university in the philosophy department and other departments, and dear participants and friends. At the outset, I must convey my gratitude for to Professor P.K. Mandal, because of whom I am here today, and also to Debabrata Saha and other friends. And I also thank ICPR for sponsoring this wonderful program. The theme that is given to me for today's talk is ethical values and well-being from the point of view of Patanjali. So this is what is given to me. So I thought it's a challenging one, but I really enjoy facing the challenges. So let me see how far I can do my best in addressing the theme. My talk is divided into two parts. And in the first part, I would be talking about the relation between ethical values and well-being. Okay, we are talking about well-being now in this pandemic. Talking about well-being has become a fashion and also has become so diversified. So how do we understand well-being in relation to ethics is a very important concern. I would be addressing this in the first part of my talk. And in the second part, I would be talking about how Ashtanga Marga. I hope I am audible, right? Am I clear, friends?
Yes, sir. Yes, sir.
Sir,
You
you
are.
are audible.
I can go ahead, right?
Yes, sir.
Yeah. In the second part of my talk, I would be concentrating on how Ashtanga Marga of Patanjali provides a holistic conception of life that is a combination of ethical values and well-being. Okay, so because most of the times we tend to think that these are modern concepts and the tradition has nothing to do with them, but actually such kind of holistic conception is already developed in our tradition. That's what I would try to present. So So this is how I have divided my talk. In the first part, I will talk about relation between ethical values and well-being. So that's what let me concentrate first on. When we talk about well-being, we have, as I said, like in the present contemporary times, because of the pandemic and subsequent concern that people have raised towards health, extending it to well-being, many different ways of looking at well-being have come into existence. So I would be in the course of the discussion addressing these following questions. Number one, what is well-being? So how should we understand what is well-being? How do we conceptualize well-being? Okay. Is it that a completely new one, or does it have any implications from the tradition that we can drag onto and understand ourselves in a better way? So this is what I would try to address. How do we conceptualize well-being, and what comprises of well-being? This is another very important aspect. We think that well-being comprises of only certain kind of things, or it comprises of only one thing. But how do we understand what are the components of this conception of well-being? Which means, what is it that comprises of well-being? And subsequently, I would also be addressing the question whether it is a state or a process. Some people tend to understand that well-being is a state, and some people argue that it is a process, right? So, how do we understand this well-being, and also whether it is natural? Okay, if we are talking about something called well-being, is it a natural thing, or is it an artificial thing that is to be cultivated? Okay, these are the different concerns that come forward when we try to explore the concept of well-being. So, in the process of discussion, we would be addressing each one of them, and subsequently, I would also be dealing with something like how is this well-being related to ethical values? Uh, does it have any relevance at all? Do we really think that ethics has something to do with well-being, or well-being has something to do with ethics? So, what kind of relation can we think of when we talk about these two? Is another concern that I would be addressing. So these are certain things that I thought I should first present them as questions that we all have to engage with, so that that provides a better perspective of how to understand well-being, and how to understand well-being's relation with ethics, and how to understand Patanjali Yoga Sutra in the light of the relation between ethical values and well-being. So this is the broader framework. I'm just drawing the canvas for you so that we can go further and have a discussion on that. So the first question is, what is well-being? How do we understand well-being? Well-being, people have different views about it, and in fact, friends, we have many disciplines, right? Academic disciplines that we see around us, and almost all the disciplines try to give a definition of well-being. Okay, which means definition of the well-being of an individual's life, individual and his life. So, for instance, if you look at the biological sciences or medicine, especially, it gives a particular kind of definition of well-being. And if you go to psychology, it provides a different kind of definition of well-being. And if you go to social sciences, it is not that the definition of well-being is only the sole prerogative of sciences. If you come to social sciences also provide you a definition of well-being in terms of social relations. And it is not just that, even if you come to humanities, people do define what is well-being. Okay, so it is not that the definition of well-being, or the nature of well-being is only limited to sciences or medicine. Okay, as we wrongly presume, it is extended, and each one of our disciplines try to define what is well-being, what is human well-being. Okay, so this is to be kept in mind, and but there is one concern that we find when we look at when we try to understand well-being in terms of any of these. For example, medicine or biology may define well-being to be the physical well-being, okay, where the health is understood to be a physical kind of one where one has to maintain physical health. And psychologists may say that it is not just physical health, but it is the mental health, which is also very important. And for them, mental health again is of different kind of way of understanding. And then you can come to social sciences where well-being is understood in terms of the maintenance of social relations by the individual. So it's not just physical, it's not just psychological, it is also relational. How you relate yourself with the other human beings is also very important when we look at the concept of well-being. So, do you understand? It is getting extended. The scope is getting extended from being merely biological to psychological as well, and then to relational as well, where we tend to understand our relation with other beings. So, and then it doesn't end there. And even in humanities, if you come to humanities, for instance, philosophy or any of these human sciences, they also try to give a definition of or understanding of conception of well-being in terms of peaceful coexistence. Okay, what is good life? What is right kind of life? And what is happy life? Okay, these are the things that are conceptualized as well-being. So when we are talking about well-being in terms of human sciences, the concern would be happy life, good life, and right kind of life. That is well-being of the individual. So it is not just if you are healthy, biologically you are happy. No, you cannot say that. If you are psychologically happy, can you say that psychologically comfortable? Can you say that you are happy? No. And if your relations, social relations are okay, can you say that if you're happy? Yeah, to some extent, but that's not the totality. So what is it that is required? Okay, so that is how human sciences stress the importance of happiness, goodness of life, happiness of life, and rightness of the life. So that is how, from each of these perspectives of the disciplines, you will have a different conception of well-being, and this is important for us to understand that you have to transcend each one of them to understand the real understanding of well-being. So well-being is not just limited to biological or psychological or to relational or to only or to relational, and it has to have a broader conception where it would be addressing issues like what is good life, what is happy life, and what is right kind of life. And that is how transcending the sectarian or biased or narrow understanding of health and well-being is required to have a broader perspective, holistic conception, integrated conception, and harmonious perspective of each of the aspects of human life is what is required. And such kind of holistic conception is what Indian philosophical tradition tries to provide us, including Patanjali Yoga Sutra. What they try to provide is they try to take us beyond this focused, narrow understanding of well-being, and they tend to tell us that you have to transcend that and try to reach a broader perspective or holistic perspective of well-being. So coming back to the point, how do we understand the relation between ethical values and well-being? See, ethics and health, well-being. If we reduce well-being to health, ethics and health, do they go together? Why should they go together? Health is something, if you understand it in a narrow way, it is biological. So why should I care about ethics there? And ethics doesn't seem to fit into this perspective. But actually, if that is the case, what kind of relation exists between ethics and health, ethics and well-being is very important. Obviously, we are now understanding that well-being is much broader than health, much broader than taking care of mere physical health or mental health. So, if we understand it that way, what kind of relation can we posit between these two, ethical values and well-being? Number one, are they dependent on each other? Is it that ethical values are dependent on well-being and well-being is dependent on ethical values? Can we assume such kind of a relation? Or is it that both of them are independent of each other and have no relation at all? Or is it that they are dependent, okay, and dependent in the sense that they are essentially related to each other in such a way that one cannot exist without the other? So these are the various possibilities of looking at the relation between ethical values and well-being, human well-being. But it is very sure that, see, there is a kind of asymmetric relation that we find between well-being and ethical values. So this asymmetrical relation is that you would find one is related essentially to the other, which means if one is not there, other will not be there, and it is not that reverse is also true. When I say that, what I mean is, see, can you have well-being without ethical values? I would say well-being definitely requires ethics. Okay, ethics of the individual and ethics of the community is very much required if you are talking about well-being. And pandemic, COVID-19 pandemic has taught us that very strongly. Okay, it has taught us that very strongly. The very the recent COVID-19 pandemic has made us realize that well-being cannot exist without ethics, and ethics at the individual level, ethics at the community level, both of them are equally important. You cannot say that no, if even if my community is not following the code of conduct, if I would follow, that is enough. No, that's not going to work out. So we have understood that. We have once again strongly understood that to lead a happy, healthy, or a life of well-being, your own selfishness of taking care of yourself is not sufficient. You have to integrate with other people as well and make them realize the ethical values, individual ethical values and community ethical values together. So this is what pandemic has taught us, and that is how well-being requires ethics, and it is not that ethics essentially requires well-being. Okay, so that is the kind of asymmetric relation that we come across between these two very important concepts. When we look at this relational aspect of well-being, relational aspect of ethical values and well-being, we have to go little broader way and try to understand the relation between individual and the world. Okay, see, we are all individual human beings who are trying to interact with the world which is given to us. Okay, which is there like us. The world is also there around us, and we interact with the world. And when we interact with the world, non-self, that non-self includes other human beings, other non-human beings, nature, and spiritual or cosmic world as well. Okay, so this relation of the individual with the other is what is understood to be a life. Okay, human life essentially is, when we use the word world and life, these two are two different words. World is something that is given to us, and when we say life, how, especially human life, how the individual is related to the world is understood to be the life. Okay, and here, when we try to understand the individual, you can understand the individual in terms of his physiology, in terms of his psychology, in terms of his spiritual component. Some people argue that along with some people may argue that the physical and mental are enough for an individual. Some people may go beyond and say that stress the importance of spirituality as well, and few more others would stress the importance of cosmic relation as well. Okay, not just physical or mental. Beyond that, spiritual and cosmic relation is also very important, and all these four components are part of the individual. This is how even our classical Indian tradition, Vedic tradition, believes and talks about Rita. The concept of Rita is developed that way. So the integration, harmonious integration of each one of these aspects that you think you may possess is very important, and that's what would lead to well-being of the individual. Similarly, an individual is related to the world. That is how when the life is conceptualized, and even there, ethics is required, which means integrated uh, interaction of the individual with the world is very much required, and that is how well-being is again connected with ethical framework. And going little further, all of us as human beings understand that existence is important for all of us, right? For all of us who are human beings who think that we exist, for us existence is very important. And is it just existence that we are concerned about? No, it is not just existence in solitude. Existence together is very important, and that's what we stress. Though we tend to believe sometimes believe that we are only concerned about our own existence, that is not completely true. When we talk about existence, we talk about existence together with the other, and that is how it is called coexistence. So it is not that we are only interested in our existence, we are interested in our existence along with the other. That is what is coexistence. That's why we often, some of the senior scholars like Professor P.K. Mandal and others stress this importance of sahakara, sahabhoga, okay, and living together and enjoying together. These are the traditional Vedic values that were enunciated in classical Indian tradition. So coexistence, is it just coexistence? Coexistence in any form? Because existence is given. Coexistence is like it can be secluded existence as well. No? All of us exist independently of our relations or with negative relations as well. Is it such kind of coexistence? No. What we look at as the well-being, conception of well-being in Indian tradition especially, is peaceful coexistence. It is existence, coexistence, and how this existence has to be peaceful coexistence. That's what we would look at. And where peaceful coexistence means each one of us actively participate in building the peace. Okay, it is not that peaceful coexistence means it is not that I can do whatever I want to rupture and create problems in the society, and even then I can aspire for well-being. That's not possible. Friends, that is the reason peace, shanti, in Indian tradition has given so much importance. Okay, you go to any of these Vedas, all these 4 Vedas, and go to Upanishads as well, you would continuously find Shanti mantras. And why these Shanti mantras? To stress the importance of peaceful coexistence of human beings. What is this peaceful coexistence? And how do we understand this peaceful coexistence? Is it not that it is given? Is it that peaceful coexistence is something that is given and you just have to enjoy it? No. You have to actively participate and work for it. Okay? So peaceful coexistence is, it's not that it is just given to us. You have to actively participate and inculcate it, and that is the only way through which you can arrive at something called well-being. Okay, so I'm trying to draw your attention to the understanding of well-being in terms of peaceful coexistence. You go to even Western tradition, Western philosophical tradition, at many places you would find the importance being stressed of peaceful coexistence. But their conception of peace and their conception of peaceful coexistence may be slightly different. But let us keep that aside. What I am trying to see is the significance of peaceful coexistence is stressed both in the classical Western tradition, modern Western tradition, and contemporary tradition as well. Similarly, in classical Indian tradition as well. Now, what is this peaceful coexistence? Is it with the other? The very first step is peaceful coexistence of the self with your own self is the first step, first thing that is required. Okay, you should be able to peacefully coexist with your own self. Okay, that is the first step. So how do you accommodate yourself, and how do you see yourself? When I say how do you accommodate yourself, that requires an understanding of how do you see yourself, how do you understand yourself. So once you start understanding yourself in a better way, that the terms like accommodating etc would become meaningless, and they lose their relevance, and you understand that you are at peace with yourself. Okay, sometimes we use these words, right? You have to be at peace with yourself. Otherwise, uh, you cannot think of extending peace to, or bringing peace to, or contributing to the peace of uh, humanity or your surroundings. So the first and foremost thing that is required is to be peaceful with oneself. That is the first step, and then to be peaceful with the other. And this other could be human other, it could be non-human other, in the sense that it could be animal or plant world, animal world, or spiritual world, or cosmic world, whatever it may be. Okay, so how do you keep yourself at peace with yourself and with others is the important thing that contributes to the well-being of the individual. So what I mean to say is the concept of well-being has to begin with the individual, but it doesn't limit with the individual. It begins with the individual, and then it extends to the relational aspect, and that is how it contributes to the holistic conception of well-being of all the individuals, which means the social good. Okay, and then it may further get extended to natural good as well, where the good which is extended beyond human beings would be stressed, and it even goes further to the cosmic understanding of well-being in terms of goodness. So that is how it goes on extended, beginning with the individual, and that's what I am trying to stress here. And this requires ethics as the base. See, if the individual wants to be at peace with himself, then what is it that is required? We understand, as we said already, that individual is a combination of physical, mental, social, economic, occupational, environmental, spiritual, cosmic, whatever, all these aspects. Okay. So finally, all these aspects can be reduced to body, mind, and spirit. Right? So if you reduce them to body, mind, and spirit within the individual, then what are the three dispositions that we come across in the classical Indian tradition? We often talk about this manasa, vacha, karmana. Okay, if you have to be peaceful with yourself, your mind, okay, your thoughts, your words, whatever you are thinking and whatever you are articulating, your language, okay, your epistemology, this has to be pure, and then your actions. So the mind and thoughts, words are to be pure, and then the actions. So the see, for example, let me mention this to you, friends. Have you ever understood? Have you ever tried to understand what do we mean by honesty in Indian tradition? We talk about honesty, right? So what is this honesty in Indian tradition? Honesty in Indian tradition is not taking bribes or anything of that sort. Honesty in Indian tradition is keeping both thought, word, and action in consonance with each other. So you would be called a virtuous person if you are able to manage your whatever you think would be spoken, and whatever you speak is to be practiced in the life. So if these three are in a harmonious relation, manasa, vacha, karmana, manas, talk, and action, if all three of them are in harmonious relation, and then you tend to be considered to be a virtuous person, an honest person, and that's what would lead you to will lead you to uh, like well-being that we are talking about. So that is how ethics plays a very important role, and ethics here I'm taking it in the broadest perspective of explaining that the individual ethics basically stresses the importance of thought, word, and action being in consonance with each other. So this is the brief description that I thought I should talk about and deliberate with regard to well-being and its relation with ethics. Okay. And there are certain other things as well I thought with regard to well-being that we should take note of. Often some people argue or put forth saying that how do you understand well-being? Well-being, is it a subjective state or an objective state? No? Is it that well-being is something that I feel that I am okay, I'm fine, I'm doing well, okay? Or are there any subjective conditions that we can specify saying that even if he is saying he is well, he is not well, these are the objective conditions. If he fulfills or if she fulfills only these conditions, that we can understand the person to be well. So is it completely an objective, subjective one, or is it an objective one? This is also a very interesting debate that is existent in the discourse on conception of well-being. Anyway, I'm not interested in going into that, but I just want to talk about it so that some of you who may be interested in this theme can go deep into it and try to respond to that, because we often understand that even if well-being is subjective one, it requires objective conditions to be fulfilled. Okay, this is how some scholars who have positivist inclinations tend to believe. Okay, whether you agree with it or not is a different story. So this is what I thought I should stress here. Let me now take you to the second part of my talk, where I wanted to stress or talk about how do we look at this Patanjali Yoga Sutra, Ashtanga Yoga of Patanjali Yoga Sutra, and understand the concept of well-being and its relation with ethics while looking at Ashtanga Marga of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. This is what my concern in the second part of my talk, into which I am going now. Friends, before I go into it further, the concept of yoga that we have in terms of either Patanjali Yoga or the yoga, diverse conceptions of yoga that we find in Bhagavad Gita. Basically, what do we mean by this yoga and how do we understand it is a very important question. And it has become so popular in the contemporary period that you can assume that at least 70% of the world population may know this term, and they may have their own conceptions of yoga, right? Even in India, if you take definitely 70% of the population may know the term yoga, but most of them may have their own conception of yoga. So this is the threat that you get of a concept if it is popularized and diversified so much. In last few years, the kind of popularity that this concept, that this term has got worldwide, has made it so diversified that like it sometimes it is reduced to one aspect of yoga, or sometimes it is extended beyond its purview, and some of such kind of things are shocking as well to some of us. Okay, so when I say this, see, we find in the contemporary times with the name yoga being reduced to one or two components or one component of Ashtanga Yoga, steps, 7 steps that are 8 steps that are provided. So that's quite unfortunate kind of thing. Like some people tend to reduce the totality of yoga, Patanjali Yoga, to only asanas, or to only pranayama, or to only meditation. Okay, I'm not saying that this is wrong, but this is only a kind of a reductionist approach, a focused approach, a specialized approach. But this approach would reduce the holistic conception that is provided to us. So that is how we have to be cautious. I often say this, that see, if you want to reach your when you go to your home, all of us are sitting at home, right? when you come from outside to your home, you have to go through the main door, right? You have to cross your door and then get in, and that is how you reach your bedroom or whatever. That is the only way of going inside. Okay, but if somebody says you try to drop into your bedroom directly, is it possible? It's not possible, right? So that is how going into uh, Patanjali Yoga, reaching to the concentration requires the first step, second step, third step as well. So when there are certain steps that are prescribed, each one of them have equal importance and they lead to the other. And if you want to take a leap from these steps and reach out to the fifth or seventh, it becomes very difficult, right? So you may not get the required result that this particular system tries to offer to us. And that is how we have to be cautious with regard to this reductionist approaches. There is, along with this reductionism, at least can be understood. These days, I have come across extension of yoga to unwanted things, non-yogic kind of things. Okay, in the reductionist approach, one of the steps of yoga are taken into consideration and specialized, that can be understood. But in this extensionist approach, you would find that something that is nowhere related to yoga would be brought in and it would be clubbed with yoga and presented to us. In this regard, I should mention, for example, sometimes I have come across something like um, dance yoga. Okay. There are people who are specializing and offering global commodities, global packages of dance yoga. And I have come across another interesting thing uh, beer yoga, beer that they drink, beer yoga, and see what not. Some of the things I cannot even explain or state here. So yoga, they have in the name of specialization, in the name of extension of yoga to certain things, they have gone beyond what can be what can be understood to be acceptable by Patanjali Yoga Sutra. That is quite unfortunate thing. That is our friends. It is important that we should have a holistic conception and holistic understanding of whatever theme that we pick up, whatever conception that we pick up, and whatever that we want to work on. So I request all of you to have such kind of conception, look for such kind of a conception so that you can do better in that field. So let me go beyond that. See, how do we understand this concept of yoga? And for instance, if you look at Advaita Vedanta, it talks in terms of union of the spiritual union of individual with the universal self. So that is how Advaita Vedanta understands yoga to be. But Patanjali Yoga Sutra doesn't understand it in the similar way. According to Patanjali Yoga Sutra, spiritual effort to attain perfection through the control of the body, senses, and mind, and through the right discrimination between subject and object, Prakriti and Purusha, is what would lead to yoga according to Patanjali Yoga Sutra. So this understanding is very important because it talks about a spiritual effort to attain perfection, because finally what is looked at is perfection. Okay, through the control of the body, senses, and mind. Okay, these three are very important concepts. Not just the body, along with the body, the senses, and the mind, because body and the mind are connected through senses. So senses play a very important role, and that is how they are to be controlled. And and further, through the discrimination between subject and object. Unfortunately, we tend to identify ourselves with the central organ, and that's how we find this saying in Advaita Vedanta, Manayeva Manushyanam Karanam Bandha Mokshayo. Mind is the one which is the cause of the bondage as well as the liberation. Since it is the one which contributes to the bondage, it is the same one, only one which can help us in reaching the liberation as well. So this discrimination of subject and object is very important in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, conception of yoga by Patanjali Yoga Sutra. When we look at this Patanjali Yoga Sutra, it is translated into more than 40 different languages, world languages, modern languages of the world, and it is divided into four parts. I'm sure if some of you are philosophy students, you may have some understanding of this book Patanjali Yoga Sutra. It has four parts: Samadhipada, which deals with the nature and aim of concentration, yoga, and Sadhanapada, which deals with which explains the means of means to realize this end. Sadhana is instruments of reaching this end, yoga. And then Vibhuti-pada, which deals with the supranormal powers which can be acquired through yoga. And then lastly, Kaivalya-pada, which describes the nature of liberation and the reality of the transcendental self. So this is how the text Patanjali Yoga Sutra is divided into. Here, what is yoga is defined in the very first part itself as yoga chitta vritti nirodha, which is translated into English as cessation of the modifications of chitta. Okay, so let me briefly try to explain each one of them. What is cessation of mental modifications of chitta? So, in order to understand this concept, like there are mind modifies itself, and these modifications ought to be restricted, or there should be a cessation, stoppage of such kind of mental modifications, and such kind stopping of mental modifications is the one which is understood to be yoga. How do we understand this further? Let me explain. What is chitta here? See, for instance, friends, those of you who are into Western philosophy and philosophy of mind, people who talk about philosophy of mind, consciousness studies, etc. It is not that Indian philosophy has dearth of consciousness studies or philosophy of mind. Indian philosophy is equally rich, and in fact, Indian philosophy is equally rich and diverse in terms of understanding philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. And so we should take special interest in Indian conception of philosophy of mind and consciousness studies. So, in this regard, what is this chitta that we are talking about? Chitta is said to be a combination of three. Chitta is basically the internal organ, which is antakarana, and it has three components. It is said to have combination of three things. And what are these three? These three are same and a part of antakarana, but on the basis of the functions, they are named in three different ways. For instance, um, when when this chitta, antakarana, is associated with the function of cognition. When you look at an object, you cognize it, right? When your chitta is associated with the function of cognition, it is called manas. Okay, and when your chitta is associated with the function of determination, understanding this to be this, or determination and understanding, then it is called buddhi or intellect. So, when you are cognizing, it is called manas, and when it is being determined and understood, then you call it to be buddhi or intellect. And when it is functioning in terms of egoism, then it is called ahankara, where I-ness is asserted, and this is how mano buddha ahankara, manas, buddhi, and ahankara are explained on the basis of the functions of same chitta. Three different functions give rise to three different conceptions called manas, buddhi, and ahankara. And chitta is understood to be the when it is associated with the function of storing of experiences and memory, it is also used to be called as chitta, and that is how it is understood to be the first evolute of Prakriti, and it has a very significant role in Yoga Sutra. Now, if this is what is Chitta, combination of these three, then how do we understand its modifications? What are its modifications? And why does it take these modifications? Okay, Chitta Vrittis is very important. And Chitta Vrittis are said to be, Chitta can provide you right knowledge. It can also provide you wrong knowledge. It can take you to imagination, and it can also lead you to absence of any kind of cognition, and it can recollect them something from the past and present it to you. So it can take any kind of these modifications, which are at least 5 in number, as presented by Patanjali Yoga Sutra in terms of pramana, viparyaya, vikalpa, nidra, and smriti. So it could be right knowledge, or it could be wrong knowledge, it could be imagination, which verbal cognition or imagination, or it could be absence of cognition completely, or it could be something that comes as an outcome of stories of the memory. Okay. But here, what is important that I want to stress here is the mental life, okay, levels of mental life. This is what is important, especially in the context of the present coronavirus pandemic. Okay, and also in the context of understanding the Western understanding of the conception of mental life. So, a classical Indian system or has gone to such an extent to even divide and categorize various mental states in such a way that it is completely exhausting in its character. So that is how levels of mental life is another important point that we should take serious note of before we get into this Ashtanga Marga of Patanjali Yoga Sutra. There, see, uh, when you if you analyze, you just sit at home with a calm mind and try to analyze your mental life, okay, levels of mental life. Each one of us can do that. Sometimes we do say that I'm restless. Okay, restless. What do we mean by that? Okay, restlessness is called kshipta. And what do we mean by this restlessness here? Uh, when your mind is restless, what is happening is your mind is tossed like a shuttlecock between various sense objects. So your mind is just going to one sense object and then immediately going to another sense object, and it is not stable anywhere. It is running here and there, and that is how you become restless. Okay, and it is a common feature to most of us, right? Say, for example, those who get used to this mobile phone these days, because mobile phone has become an extended self for all of us, right? So, what is your extended self? Sometime back, people used to say that your extended self is your offspring, right? Your children. But these days, your extended self is not your children. Your extended self is your mobile, right? Electronic device. Because if you shout at your children, they may get hurt. But even if you throw your mobile phone, it will not get hurt. Only you will get hurt because you have to buy it again, right? So that is how. If you look at this mobile phone, those who are addicted to mobile phone will know it better. You enter into a Facebook or some website, and it is not that you are interested and you get focused on that. You would be moving it. Most of the times we see people holding it and moving it like this. So I really get surprised. What is happening here? They are in the state of restlessness, shifta. They don't focus on anything. Their mind is moving from one to the other of these sense objects continuously. Right? This is the state that we find. Most of us are in such kind of a state in this present pandemic times. And the second level is mudha, where sometimes we are also like in a lethargic state, torpid state, right? Where we don't feel like doing anything, and Such kind of state is also one of the mental levels that we find each one of us sometimes. And the third level is, yeah, you are able to identify and stay with an object, sense object, but you are getting distracted quickly. So this is vikshipta. See, these are all there in our own selves. Okay, these are our own mental states. You don't think that this is some theory which is presented elsewhere. Okay, this theory, if you look at each one of the levels and aspects, they are there in each one of us. We do get restless, which means we tend to go from one sense object to the another other sense object and continuously get tossed between these like a shuttlecock. And then we also sometimes feel torpid and like lethargic, and we sometimes we tend to be like getting some attention, okay, focus, and then immediately getting distracted. And then next level is ekagra, where you will be able to concentrate on something. Okay, mind becomes concentrated on the object of whatever focus that you have, or it could be object of meditation, or if you are doing your studies, it could be concentration is on your studies. And this is a very important stage. And subsequent stage is what is the final one called the Nirudha, which is restricted mental modifications. So here mental modifications are completely arrested. So these are the various levels of mental life that we can think of. Okay. And reaching to this last level is what is very important for the individual in order to have a holistic conception of his own life. And last thing, reaching to Nirudha is what is stated to be the cessation of modifications of chitta. So, cessation of mental modifications is what is understood to be Nirudha, the refined mental state of mental level that is very important. And this is what would lead us to a kind of understanding, proper understanding of well-being. Okay, so when you are thinking, sitting with yourself and thinking whether can I be considered to be having possessing a good well-being? You're talking about, you're asking this question to yourself, whether am I well? Can I consider myself to be well? Then these are the things that you have to analyze. You have to analyze your chitta vrittis, you have to analyze your mental bhumis, levels of mental life, okay, chitta bhumis, so that you will have an understanding of whether you are reaching the level of well-being or not. Okay, so I thought this is very important and it has to be stressed, because we often tend to understand that the analysis of mind is only the Western kind of one, and Indian analysis of mind doesn't exist. So that's how this is very important to me. Now, coming to this Ashtanga Yoga that we have, 8 steps that we have, which are understood to be 8 limbs or eightfold path of discipline that we talk about. Again, here, what is being stressed is, as I said initially as well, the body and the mind. And the link between body and the mind is sense organs. How do you control body and mind, and also the link between these two, which is senses, is very important. And this is what is stressed here in the course of discussion of Ashtanga Yoga. Friends, I have, please stop me if I am crossing my limits of time. Debabrata ji, please do let me know if I am crossing my time. I'll try to complete within another 15 minutes, right?
Okay, sir.
Sir, it's okay. You
I can have
continue,
another
sir.
15 minutes, right?
Yeah, sure, sir.
Yeah, it's not just the organizers. Even if the audience are also getting bored, you can stop me, right? So that we can have a discussion. If you're getting bored with my talk, you please do stop me, okay? Because one way kind of lecture, and also for me, it is so monotonous to speak for 1 hour to my own computer, right? Because all of you have closed your cameras, so I cannot see anybody. I see myself and my laptop and talk to that. It looks very funny sometimes, but still, this has become the norm of new normal, right? So so at least for some more time we have to continue to live with, right?
So
Anyway,
feels like a
yeah,
monologue,
coming
sir.
back to it's monologue, right? At least sometimes friends like you come intervene and say something. So that, and also it's good that some friends are also sending the messages. That also at least distracts and makes me aware that no, it's not monologue. People are listening to me and responding.
Sir, I'm
Good.
dying to ask
Uh,
questions, but I'll let you finish your talk because it
See,
might
you need
divert
not die.
your lecture. So I'm dying to ask questions, sir. But first, I'll let you finish your lecture, sir. Okay. Yeah.
Yeah, probably I'll make this statement at the end of my lecture that no questions should be asked. Okay. So don't prepare your questions at all. Right. Anyway, friends, let me get back to the talk. Yeah. Now coming to this Ashtanga Yoga that we are referring to. As I said, body and mind and the senses are to be controlled. And we begin with Yama. See, sometime back I was referring to this statement that unfortunately people are straight away trying to reach the fifth step or fourth step or eighth step of Ashtanga Yoga. I would always stress the importance of the first step. Okay, first step is so important. See, if you're a small kid, your first step is when you are learning, when you are learning to walk, your first step is very important. Okay, and you cannot think of running without putting your first step. So that is how. That's why I say you have to enter through your door. No, you cannot enter from anywhere. You have to enter through a door when door is prescribed, and you have to put your feet on the first step when it is prescribed. Right? That is how. And when you look at Ashtanga Yoga, the first step is very important. And the first step is also important. First step and second step. Yama, Niyama are also important because they have an ethical value. Okay, so why should we practice Yama and Niyama? Because they have an ethical value, ethical perspective. Unless you qualify yourself doing these things, practicing these things continuously, you cannot go to the next steps and try to complete them. No? Some people tend to say like, yeah, I sit for 1 hour, 2 hours in meditation, but I'm not able to do that. No, I completely get distracted continuously. Point is, see, you have to go from first step onwards. Then you would be slowly arresting certain things, stopping certain thoughts. So it goes like a filter. It purifies step by step your mind so that you become qualified to be concentrating and sitting in a meditation like samadhi. So that's how the first step, Yama, is very important. Yama talks about restraints, which means abstention. You have to abstain from certain kind of things, and you have to do certain kind of things. Do's and don'ts that we talk about in our in fact, when we say do's and don'ts, what we mean is there are certain things in life which can be repeated, and there are certain kind of things which cannot be repeated. So, from your childhood onwards, your parents would be telling you those things that you can repeat every day, and those things that you cannot repeat. Okay, for example, if you're spoiling the bedroom, then they would say, no, you should not do that. No, they would be telling you what to do, where. So that is how. What are the things if you're lying? They stop you from lying because they tell you that this is not what you should repeat. Okay, and they will tell you what is to repeat, what is to be repeated. So this is how the whole process of life from the beginning. Whole process of learning, whole process of knowledge continues with this repetition. What to repeat and what not to repeat. Okay. The first one, yama, is what not to repeat. Restraints. You have to restrain yourself from certain things. What are these things? Like you have to abstain yourself from non-injury, which is ahimsa. Okay. You have to abstain from injury so that you lead to ahimsa. You have to abstain from falsehood so that you can reach satya. You have to abstain from stealing so that you can reach asteya. You have to abstain from avarice so that you can reach aparigraha. You have to abstain from passions and lust so that you can reach brahmacharya. So abstinence from these negative things are very important, and you have to. So this process of abstinence purifies, provides like a filter. It would work like a filter for your mind for the next days. Okay, your body for the next days. As I said, when we are talking about ahimsa, especially ahimsa, satyam, asteyam, aparigraha, brahmacharya, whichever that we are referring to, all of them tend to say that your body, your mind, your word, and your actions, all of them have to follow these abstentions. Okay, it is not that when I am thinking, I don't. I abstain myself, but when I am acting, I don't abstain myself. You cannot go that way, or you cannot say that when I am talking, I abstain myself, but when I'm doing, I'm fine doing it. Okay, so that's not going to work. That's how the harmony between thought, word, and action is very important, and that is what is being stressed here in yamas. And the second step that we come to in 8 steps, yama, niyama, asana, pranayama, pratyahara, dharana, dhyana, and samadhi. The second one is niyama. Niyama is basically observance, do's. What are the things that you should do? So the first one is about abstinence. Okay, the things that you should not do, like you should filter yourself with certain kind of things. And the second step is what are the things that you must do. Okay, so here importance is given to the first thing is saucha. Saucha is purification. Purification in terms of internal and external. Okay, purification is not just external. Purification is internal as well. And once you practice yamas, obviously the second step, following niyamas, becomes easy. Okay, because you have already filtered certain kind of things, and that is how following the second step becomes easy. Okay, and saucha, sometimes this purification is a very has become a very political kind of one for a long time, at least in Indian tradition, in the modern period. And though some people have talked about purification, idealized it, and some people have radically differed and took an opposite stance and said this purification has larger implications on social life, and that is how they rejected it. And now, in the pandemic, we have understood that saucha is a very important kind of one. Purification is very important kind of one. Even if you go out for work and after coming home immediately, it is better you completely clean yourself, sanitize yourself before going into home, right? So such kind of importance of purification has come to us once again, but this was also followed in the classical Indian tradition. So what I mean to say is there are certain observances which lead to a kind of self-culture that were prescribed by Patanjali Yoga Sutra in terms of, in the name of niyamas. And the first important one is saucha, which talks about internal and external purification. The second one is santosha. Often, unfortunately, santosha is translated as happiness, but santosha is not happiness. Santosha is contentment. Okay, whatever you have, you should be able to be content with that. So only that way, your negative emotions can be restricted. And contentment. The third one is tapas, which is austerity, And the fourth one is Swadhyaya, self-study. And in the pandemic times, we have understood the importance of Swadhyaya very well. It is not that you have to depend on your teachers' lectures all the time. You have to start reading on your own as well, which is very important. And Swadhyaya, self-study, has a very important place. And the fifth one is Ishvara Pranidhana, which is devotion to any object, any kind of concept that you think is important to your life. Ishvara Pranidhana is devotion to God, but it is not just restricted to God. You can even posit something else like humanism to be your focal point, and then be devoted to that, right? So that is how we have observance of certain aspects which culture yourself, and which includes purification, contentment, austerity, self-study, and devotion to whatever you choose to be your focus. So this is how these niyamas are very important, and a combination of yama and the filters and culturing of oneself. Okay, these two will provide you further way forward. Okay, and that is how we reach asanas, where uh, asana is understood to be steady, comfortable posture. There are various asanas that are prescribed, and a combination of these three aspects are related to the physical life, bodily kind of one. Okay, and now we reach the fourth important aspect of Yoga Sutra, Astanga Marga, Astanga Yoga, that is pranayama, which is controlling of the breath, which is regulation of inhalation, retention, and exhalation. See, there is a difference between Buddhist Anapanasati and Patanjali Yoga Sutra. In Anapanasati, Buddhist conception of meditation on breath, you are asked to observe the process of breathing. Okay, but here you are asked to regulate the process of breathing. So these two are two different ones. And here regulation means inhalation, retention, and exhalation. Okay, and this is of course very beneficial to health and conducive to concentration of mind. And this the pranayama is very important because it is the one which connects the body with the mind. Okay, how does it connect the body with mind? Once you regulate your breath, obviously it contributes to the physical health, because the supply of oxygen, etc., in the body would be regulated and purified, provided in a proper way, and this would further lead to concentration of the mind. Okay, your mind, though it is something different from the physical one, but still it is dependent on the physical one, in the sense that if the physical one has some purity and calmness, that gets reflected in the mind. That is how pranayama works as a link between the body and the mind, and it purifies the body, and it also contributes richly to the concentration of the mind. So that's how it has a dual role, which we have to understand. And then we come to the fifth aspect, pratyahara, which is withdrawing of the senses. And senses naturally, as I said, make you restless, run from one to the other continuously. And in fact, in Yoga Vasistha, Rama tries to explain the mind and the senses, mind especially, as something that runs like a street dog. It goes to one place, and as though it has some urgent work there, and then it smells and comes back to another. Okay, so it doesn't stay with one object of senses. It continuously gets tossed between different objects of the senses. So here pratyahara, that is how is required to for the sake of further development, that you have to withdraw your senses, and senses naturally go towards the objects, and it must be diverted inwards. So sense organs are the ones which again connect the body with the mind, and which are open to the outside world. And once you close them from the outside world, they get a chance to go inward, and that is how they prepare the mind for the next step. Okay, so pratyahara, that is how, plays a very significant role in this regard. And dharana is fixing the mind on the object of meditation. It can be a tip of nose, or like some people say that you should concentrate on the midpoint of the eyebrows, or keep a some people say that there is a heart, there is a lotus in the heart, and you concentrate on that, or a deity or a symbol, whatever. But fixing the mind, because mind tends to run to various places, and it has to be fixed somewhere, so that you stop the other things coming into the mind. So that's how dharana is very important, and this leads to. So here, what happens is, mind must be steadfast like unflickering flame of lamp on this object that we are looking at. And then jhana, concentration, where the object and the act remain separate, and the undisturbed flow of thought goes around the object of meditation, and steadfast contemplation without any break. In dharana, there is a possibility of breaks, but in dhyana, there is no possibility of break. The steadfast contemplation goes without any break. And this leads to samadhi, and we all know mind is completely absorbed in the object of meditation, and the act and the object of meditation become one. And this samadhi is again divided into samprajñat samadhi and asamprajñat samadhi. And asamprajñat samadhi is the one which is understood to be the last chitta bhumi, nirudha, okay, where cessation of mental modifications happen. See, these Ashtanga Yoga that are presented to us, 8 steps that are presented to us, let me relate them to the concept of well-being that I have discussed earlier. As I said, when we are talking about well-being, what is important is the holistic concept is important. It is not just concentrating on one, rather concentrating on all the aspects of human life, and the individual are very important. And that is how you would find talking about restrictions and talking about observance of aspects of self-culture, and then stabling yourself in a particular posture, okay, and up to here concentrating on the body, and then taking it further to the sense organs and withdrawing the sense organs. And that is how allowing the mind to concentrate, which means body, senses, and mind. All 3 of them were said to be placed in a harmonious relation, in an integrated relation, so that leads to conception of, or that leads to what we call a good life, or a possibility of a good life, or happy life, or right kind of life as well, which is a combination of ethics, because what is being stated in Yama and Niyama, these are ethical principles. Especially if you look at any other philosophical system in India, including non-Vedic systems, you would find these to be cardinal virtues: ahimsa, satyam, asteyam, aparigraha, brahmacharya. These 5 are considered to be cardinal virtues. So that is how ethical values are stressed here as the first step. Unless you are ethical, you cannot go to the next step. And these ethical values are at the individual level, and you have to practice them at the individual level, so that you tend to extend them at the community level as well. Okay. So if you are stressing the importance of community ethics cannot exist without giving proper importance to individual ethics. So individuals who comprise the community have to practice this ethics, and the similar kind of one that you find in Niyama as well. So what I'm trying to say is, if at all we are talking in terms of, if at all we are understanding well-being in terms of the relation at the individual level, the relation between mind, word, and thought, okay, action, word, and thought, then Patanjali Yoga Sutra is the one which tries to tell you that you have to put them in harmony. And if you are understanding well-being in terms of the physical, mental, and the spiritual, even then, Patanjali Yoga Sutra is the one which is telling you that you have to place these three things in harmony with each other through this Ashtanga Yoga. And if you understand well-being to be like good life, happy life, and right kind of life, even there, Patanjali Yoga Sutra is the one which is telling us that by following its code of conduct, by following its 8 steps, you can achieve such kind of good life, happy life, and right kind of life, which would lead to well-being. And finally, if you are defining well-being to be peaceful coexistence, okay, peaceful coexistence, even then these 8 steps that are prescribed would help us to lead a life of peaceful coexistence where the other is you're important and the other is also important, and together leading a life of peaceful coexistence. Peace is very important here, and that is how this holistic conception that is provided through Ashtanga Yoga, and also in terms of mental modifications and Chitta Bhumis is very important to us in placing the understanding of well-being, concept of well-being in relation to ethical values is very important. This is what I thought I should stress this morning. Thank you so much. All of you have listened to me with a lot of patience, and yeah, I'm done with it. Thank you so much. Yeah.
Thank you so much, sir, for taking us on a journey of self-reflection with your extremely comprehensive lecture. Although I think all of us would agree that we would love to listen to you more and more. I personally feel very refreshed intellectually and believe that we can take this discussion forward sometime. Now we can open this session for discussion. If the participants have any questions, and I personally would like to ask you some questions, which I've been sitting on those questions for a long time. But first, I think I should give our students the opportunity. Our PhD research scholar Moitri Goswami has some observation and some questions. Moitri is present here. Moitri, would you like to ask the questions yourself? Would you like to ask, sir, or should I read your questions for sir?
Yeah,
You are present, Moitri?
read those questions. That would be
Okay. Okay. She has some observations and some questions. She has written, in my observation, Aparigraha and Santosh help for the peaceful coexistence and also for the individual. I think this is her observation. And another question is, sir, is reverse possible in Chitta Bhumi? I'm not clear about this question. And another observation is, yama and niyama are self-filtering steps, but now we understand yoga to only meditation. So I cannot reach the goal of well-being. Yeah, that is an observation. And the question is there any difference between happiness and peace? Okay, Moitri has written she is traveling, so she cannot talk right now. But her question is there any difference between happiness and peace? And yeah, that is her question.
Yeah, thank you, Maitri, for these observations and question. I completely agree with you on the point that Aparigraha and Santosha, both of them help for peaceful coexistence, because Santosha provides contentment, and that is how it stops your greediness. And Aparigraha also stops you from taking away the positions of others, and that is how it works well for social and peaceful coexistence. And I agree with you on that particular point. And is the reverse possible in Chittapumi? Chittapumi basically, as it is presented in Patanjali Yoga Sutra, these are different levels of mental levels that are stressed in terms of Kshipta, Moodha, Vikshipta, and Ekagra, and finally Nirudha. So it is not that once if you have reached a stage of Ekagra, it is not that you would remain there. There is a possibility of falling back to Kshipta as well. So that is how, though there is a gradual movement from one to the other that is possible, it is not that once you reach Nirudha, you would completely remain there, or once you reach Ekagra, you would completely remain there. There is a possibility that after some time you may become Modha as well. So I don't know whether we should call it reversal, but this flexibility that is existent has to be understood. This possibility of falling back and coming back to the first stage is also always possible. That has to be kept in mind. Is there any difference between happiness and peace?
অনন্যা,
হ্যাঁ বলুন।
স্যার মনে হয়
ওরা লিভ করেছেন, আবার জয়েন করবেন, ওনার নিশ্চয়ই নেটওয়ার্কের প্রবলেম হচ্ছে।
ওকে,
ওয়েট করি আমরা একটু। হ্যাঁ So can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm sorry, I lost my connectivity.
Yeah, it's okay.
But I think now I see the question. Yeah, I was reacting to the distinction that you made between happiness and peace. When yourself to be at peace, and is it that only when you are happy you call yourself to be at peace with yourself? No. Okay, so that makes the distinction between happiness and peace very clear to us. So it is not that peace requires happiness all the time. Okay, peace is a state which is beyond sorrow, and so that's the very important, because peace is the one which goes beyond the binaries, and happiness is only one of the states, mental states, right? So that is how you have to understand the difference between these two. And the last question, I don't remember, and also since I had rejoined,
Yeah,
all these questions that are in the chat room have gone.
Yeah, sir.
Sorry.
I'll read it for you. Yeah. So, my friend and colleague, Miss Apri Datta, wants to ask you something. Apri, please go ahead with your question.
Okay. Am I audible to all of you?
Yeah, you're audible.
Am I audible?
Yeah.
Okay,
Yeah,
sir.
you are audible.
Thank you so much, sir. Okay. Sir, thank you so much for your excellent elucidation and lecture. But I have some queries or clarifications, you can say, that I would like to I would like to make a connection between Buddhist philosophy, or especially Buddhist ethics, and yoga philosophy, especially regarding Ashtangik Marga of Buddhist philosophy. Ah, and again, in your presentation, you have pointed out that the holistic approach of well-being, I think that is also found in Buddhist philosophy. If we look at the notion of bodhisattva and arhatva, bodhisattva is for the well-being for the entire society, and arhat for the well-being for oneself. So I think in these 2 points, there may have an influence of Patanjali on Gautam Buddha. This is my observation, and if you say something about this.
Yeah, thank you for making these observations, Arpi. In fact, I'm not a competent person to talk about the relation between Buddhist conceptions and Patanjali Yoga's conceptions, but there is a wonderful scholar, Pradeep Gokhale, Professor Pradeep
Yes, sir.
Gokhale from
Professor Pradeep
Pune
Gokhale from Pune
He
University,
has
right?
done a wonderful work.
Hmm.
Pune University. He has done a wonderful work in this direction, and I think his recent work is on the relation, or whether who has taken what from whom. No? He argues
Okay, sir.
that Patanjali Yoga Sutra has taken its sources from Buddhism. That's what he argues. Okay. Yeah, this is contentious aspects, but there is much work which is done in this direction. You can have a look at that discussion. Okay. Uh, Here I am only concentrating on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. That is how I did not get into Buddhist conception in detail. Okay. Friends, for the sake of all of you, I would like to mention one thing. I've been organizing Mahabharata webinar series. Uh, in fact, so far we have conducted 30, we have recorded 36, like 37 lectures, which are given by various scholars, established scholars in the field of Mahabharata studies. And Pradeep Gokhale also has given a talk there where he spoke about this particular aspect that Apri is asking. So I suggest that those who are interested should watch those videos, which are available on our YouTube channel. Right? Thank you.
Most welcome, sir.
Is it available on YouTube?
Yes, it is available on YouTube.
Okay, thank you. Sir, I wanted to ask whether can you give us a brief idea about philosophical counseling? Actually, sir, I have a very preliminary training on cognitive behavior therapy from Jadavpur University, and here at Kaji Nazru University also we have a center for counseling and positive psychology, where I am one of the joint coordinators along with teachers from the applied psychology department. So we are interested in it, and we organize frequent programs from this center, apart from the counseling services that are provided by the specialists. And also I have recently submitted my PhD thesis on the narrative self, where I have also studied about the dialogical self theories, the DST by Hubert J. Hermans. Sorry, I'm not much well versed in the Indian aspect, but I have always felt that there is so much about the self and the mind in Indian philosophy that I have to later do some comparative work on it. So in any case, I'm interested in mind and the applicative aspect. So I'm trying to know what is this philosophical counseling, and from which schools or from which philosophical thoughts is it derived. And I think it will not be a deviation from the topic, since we were discussing about well-being. So if anybody is in distress and also doesn't have a philosophical background. So how do you do it, sir? Just can you give us some ideas, sir?
Yeah, basically, as human beings, as living human beings, all of us have so many concerns, so many problems, so many issues, so many concerns. Not all problems can be reduced to biological ones. Okay, it is not that all the problems that individual human being in his life has or have are limited only to the biological ones. Okay, similarly, you cannot reduce all the concerns to psychological ones as well. Okay, beyond these biological and psychological concerns, we have certain other kinds of concerns which are left untouched. For instance, there would be a lot of like ethical dilemmas that we come across, and sometimes we may have unarticulated assumptions with which we live, and we tend to think that for me it should not be this way, but for others it could be this way, right? So such kind of epistemological biases that we would have, and how do we address such kind of biases? A psychologist, a doctor, medical practitioner may not be able to address such kind of concerns. Similarly, a psychologist also may not be able to completely address such kind of concerns. But a philosophy student who is trained in making a good understanding of epistemology, metaphysics, and ethics and logic would be able to address such kind of human concerns which are beyond the purview of medical practice and beyond the purview of psychological domain in a better way. So by saying this, I am not saying that philosophical counseling will encroach into the domains of others. It has its own specific domain. Okay. And I'm also saying that philosophical counseling cannot do everything. It can only do a limited scope that it has, and it can do very well there. Say, for example, each one of us friends, most of you may be students, and some of you may be colleagues in the universities. So at some point of time or the other, we would face a crisis situation where we think that I cannot get out of this kind of a situation. I am really caught up, and it's really frustrating. Each one of us will face such kind of situation at some point of time or the other. And in such kind of situations, you just require a person who is stable, who is trained well in philosophical understanding, so that he would or she would help us in overcoming the difficulty, overcoming the situation. Because these are all like the external world doesn't change for each one of us, but the way we look at them changes to each one of them. So that's where we have to concentrate, and that's where philosophical counseling will be very useful. In fact, I work closely with American Philosophy Practitioners Association. And if any of you are interested in knowing about philosophical counseling or needs a counseling session, you can mail me. I'll provide my mail address here. And American Philosophy Practitioners Association, with which I work, is headed by Professor Lou Marinoff, who is a pioneer in this philosophical counseling movement, who has written many works on it, and he states very interestingly that philosophical counseling is the therapy of the same. When he says that, what he means is, it is not that the other client who is coming to us is sick and he's not unwell, he's not well, that is how he's coming to us. No, any one of us, I can be your client tomorrow, and you can be my client tomorrow. Only thing is, I just want to clarify certain things in my mind which I am not able to do on my own. I need somebody's help. For example, Socrates, the Socratic dialogue is the one which is quite popular, and along with that, Socratic midwifery, intellectual midwifery is another important method that is being prescribed, where you meet the client and you help the client as a midwife to come out of the difficulty that he or she has. So mostly what we provide is we provide an outlet, and most of the times we understand that once you start articulating your problem, half of your problem gets resolved. Since we keep it in our mind and we start becoming chitta, no? Restless, you are not able to come out with it. But you start articulating it, talk to others, then it gets slowly dissolved. Okay. Unfortunately, sometime back we used to have joint families and many more people around us with whom you can share. Now, in this contemporary world, we have been continuously telling people that don't trust the other, don't believe the other. And that is where you are not able to open up yourself, because each one of us require an outlet. Even I require an outlet. You may also require an outlet. And if you are not getting that outlet where you can open up yourself, then you will be bottling up, which creates a lot of psychological and biological disturbances as well. Okay, and that is where philosophical counseling works well. So, philosophical counseling, a counselor as a profession tries to help the client. We are not saying patient, because philosophical counseling can be provided only to the rational, uh, uh, normal beings. Okay, you and me, people like you and me. Okay, if somebody has a serious psychological problem, he or she may not fit for this philosophical counseling. So that's how philosophical counselor is a professional who tries to help the client, who is a rational being, in coming out of the kind of biases, epistemological biases, or ethical dilemmas, or any other kind of concern related to self-improvement and self-development. Okay, that's where philosophical concept plays a significant role. So I think that now in India, it's not quite popular in India some time back. Now it is gaining its prominence, and I have been giving continuous lectures on philosophical counseling on many platforms in India and everywhere. So I think you should also take it seriously to include philosophical counseling as one of the optional papers, at least for the sake of the students, because they may get uh, a job. You know? So,
Yeah,
because at the end of the day, the question that comes forward is, what should I do after doing philosophy?
yeah,
Only
yeah.
few continue with research. Some people should be able to get their other opportunities as well, and that is how philosophical counseling will really work well. So all of us should have a close, careful look at this particular growing discipline called philosophical counseling. Thank you so much for asking, Brent.
Yeah. So, you were saying it is not certainly not an alternative to psychological therapies, but it can still resolve conflict. And you said of rational people, just like Krishna counseled Arjun, that in that kind of situation. And so, where from is the philosophical from which philosophical theories is it derived from Indian philosophical system or Western or both?
As of now, only uh, Western theories have explored quite well. For example, Stoicism is quite popular. Stoics'
Okay,
perception of life is quite popular, and Socratic
okay,
method is quite popular. And
okay,
existentialism and phenomenological methods are quite popular.
yeah,
From Indian perspective, there is less work that is done, and in fact, this year uh,
yeah.
I brought out a special volume of philosophical practice. It is a journal by American Philosophy Practitioners Association, where we included 6 articles from Indian perspective of philosophical counseling. So
Wow, that's great.
that's our
That's
first attempt. But
okay.
like some of you should come forward, and we
Yeah,
can contribute. No? We can fill the gaps.
yeah,
And it is
yeah,
a fertile area, friends. You should come forward, and you would be the pioneers. Okay.
yeah. Yeah, and I think that this is a great suggestion, sir, because students of philosophy are they are already studying philosophy, and if they can apply it to something, that would be great for the society and for themselves as well. Yeah. Thank you so much, sir. I think
Absolutely.
I'll get in touch with you regarding this.
Please do that. Please.
Thank you so much, sir. And we have with us a very senior professor, Prabdut Kumar Mondal. Sir, if you want to say something, sir has been with us throughout the lecture. If sir wants to say something, Professor Mondal. Are we connected?
স্যার মানে মাইক্রোফোনটা অন করতে পারছেন না মনে হয়
আচ্ছা আচ্ছা হ্যাঁ আচ্ছা আচ্ছা হতে পারে
আমরা তো এখানে এসে
হ্যাঁ sir is connected but okay
Yeah,
so
I understand.
I would okay I would now request Dr. Devabruta Shaha, respected head, Department of Philosophy, Kazi Nazrud University, to give the formal vote of thanks.
Thank you very much, sir, for your thought-provoking lecture. Your lecture enriched us and has opened a new vision to go for research on Patanjali Yoga Sutra. Hope all the participants also enjoyed your valuable lecture. Thank you again, sir, for your virtual presence with your rich and thought-provoking lecture.
Thank you.
Okay, sir.
Thank you so much, and thank you so much for providing this opportunity to meet you all and talk to our friends here. I really appreciate this kind of invitation.
Thank you.